So some of you might have had a similar experience, but back in the 80s, there was a Russian Jewish immigrant family that moved to Monroe, New York, where I used to serve as rabbi. And members of the synagogue met them at the airport and brought them to the apartment that we rented for them. And we got them settled. We left them some basic groceries. We weren't sure exactly what they wanted. And then we kind of let them, let them settle into the place. A day later, one of the members of the synagogue took them and went to the apartment and said, we're happy to take you to do a regular shopping. And this couple and their child drove with the person to the supermarket in the neighborhood and walked into the supermarket, and they looked around and they were very quiet. It chose a couple of things from the fruit and vegetable section. And the member of the shul said, it's okay. We've collected money. We want to help you get settled. Don't worry about what stuff costs for right now. Soon enough, you'll have jobs. Everything will be okay. And they kept on going, taking like a little thing here. And then they got to the cereal aisle. And they just stopped in the middle of the cereal aisle and looked. They looked to the right and they looked to the left and looked up and they looked down like an American supermarket. And in their very, very basic English, they said, in Russia, we were lucky if there was any cereal on the shelf. But here, there's just too much. We can't choose. Please choose for us. The Torah reading for this week offers a way to think about choice that is intriguing. So we are still wandering in the desert, wandering in the wilderness, as if you didn't know. And the daughters of a man named Slofchad come to Moshe with a problem. And they say, our father died, and according to the rules of inheritance as daughters, we have no right to inherit the land that his descendants would receive when they entered the land of Israel. And they say to Moshe, why should our dad's name be erased? Give us a holding in the midst of our uncles. Tana lanu achuzah betoch achei avinu. In other words, in Israel, when every tribe is offered territory and every family is offered land in those territories, give us some as well. It's not fair that just because we're women, our father's name will be erased. And Moshe takes the request to God, who says the daughters of Tzlofchad spoke correctly. Give them an inheritance. There are several midrashim that add context to the story. And according to one of them, or a group of them, this whole story actually happened not in this place in the Torah. It happened someplace else in the Torah, in the timeline of the Torah. It happened really at the end of the wander, at the moment when Aaron died. It was the 40th year. And they were about to enter Israel, but some people overwhelmed at that moment, just after Aaron died, said, let's go back to Egypt. They were so overwhelmed at the thought of living a truly free life that they wanted to go back. They wanted to go back and be slaves. In the wilderness, where to camp, what to eat, and more was decided for them. But Israel, in their mind, was the place of too many choices. It was the cereal aisle. They wanted to go back to the certainty of the place that their parents knew was a prison, but in their minds, this new generation, Egypt was a comfortable womb, a place where they would be taken care of. Yeah, they would have to work really hard, they'd be slaves, but they wouldn't have to deal with choice, and they weren't prepared for it, and they didn't know what to do, and they said, we want to go back. And at that moment, according to the Midrash, the daughters of Slofchad came forward and said, we want a holding in the land of Israel. In other words, everybody else saying, we want to go back to Egypt, and these women say, no, 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 we want a holding in the land of Israel. And the Midrash imagines Moshe saying to them, all of Israel wants to go back to Egypt, and you want an inheritance in the land of Israel? And I would love to imagine these 5 women. I imagine them as 5 very strong women responding to Moshe in a very cool and even tone. In the end, we're all going to be in Israel. In other words, like, this train is only going in one direction. We're not going back to Egypt. That is not an option. We're going to Israel, and we want a place of some choices. In other words, in the imagination of the spectacular Midrash, when faced with the choice of going back to Egypt, the land of no choice, these women chose Israel, a place where they would have to make choices. As farmers, they'd need to decide what to grow and how to deal with the inevitable insects and lack of rain. They would build houses, but they'd need to figure out how to build a house. Like, what do you build when you've lived in tents for your whole life? They would establish families and raise children and had friendships, and all of this, as we know, requires choices, constant choice. But what's interesting to me is They weren't yearning for the American version of choice, endless kinds of cereal, too many cable channels to ever watch in a lifetime, an internet where you can buy almost everything with the push of a button. They chose commitment. They chose claiming an obligation. The word that they describe when they say what they want is we want an ahuzah. We want a holding. We want something to grasp, a piece of land that would anchor our father's memory in that of the entire Jewish people. But along with this, they had to know that having land would limit their choices. Farmers can't just get up and go whenever they want. The needs of the land are insatiable. Water and fertilizer and care of animals, all of this constrains us. But they were okay with that. There's been a lot written about the problem of too much choice in our society. Professor Barry Schwartz writes that autonomy and freedom of choice are critical to our well-being, and choice is critical to freedom and autonomy. Nonetheless, though modern Americans have more choice than any group of people ever has before, and thus presumably more freedom and autonomy, we don't seem to be benefiting from it psychologically. And he talks about, this was all before Corona, he talks about the many ways that too much choice affects our mental health. People are depressed. People are overwhelmed. He offers a rubric for making choices when we're overwhelmed. He said, number one, decide on your goals, evaluate the importance of each one, lay out the options, decide which of these options is likely to help me meet my goal, pick the winning goal, and of course, be ready to change if things don't work out. And he argues that if we do this simple act of looking at our choices, just deciding on our options first before we look at our choices, we won't be overwhelmed. If you need the Fiber One cereal, there's only one thing to buy. You shouldn't be buying the cornflakes or the Cheerios or the sugar-covered cereals. He argues that if we do this, we'll be happier people because we'll make choices based on what we need, based on our values, on where we want to be, and on who we want to be. These days, I think for us, the notion of infinite choice is on its head. There are many whose choices in life are constrained because of the brutal way that this disease affects families and incomes. And for so many sitting in our homes, we're not free to do what we want when we want. The cultural riches of New York City are closed to us. We can't even go to shul right now, although hopefully we'll be able to do that soon. And as many of you know, just because you choose something from the supermarket does not mean that Instacart or Peapod will deliver your carefully chosen item. And the fine print of "we will substitute" has new meaning when you order one thing and you get something totally different. I hope that we can get back to a time of too much choice and that we can make our country a place where everybody has the choices that they need. But until then, we have to protect one another. We have to do what we can to keep this disease in check. And we have to look for those places, despite the constraints, where we do have agency and choice. We can and should find our person. We should identify our people. Commit to the values and the causes that are important to us. Come here and say, I hold on to my Judaism at a time when so much feels in flux. Living within well-chosen limits, commitments, is in some ways more liberating than having all the choice in the world. Bnot Tzlofchad, the daughters of Tzlofchad, teach us about what it means to use your voice. They teach us about agency. They teach us about listening to women and more. But they also come forward and say, we want a holding in the land of Israel. Moshe says, everybody wants to go back to Egypt, and you want a holding, an inheritance in the land of Israel? And they say, yeah, we know. In the end, we're all going to be in Israel. It's going to be a place where we're going to have a lot of choices to make, but we're okay with that. We're ready to make that commitment. We're ready to limit ourselves in some ways so that we can be very free in others. I want to show everyone a Shabbat Shalom.